London, summer, 1305. The cobblestones are wet with morning dew. The city smells of smoke, sweat, rotting waste, and something else. Something heavier. Something almost metallic. Something like fear. A crowd gathers by the thousands. Children sit on shoulders. Street vendors shout over one another, selling meat pies and warm ale. Laughter drifts through the air. There is excitement in the streets, the kind that usually belongs to festivals, weddings, or royal celebrations. But this is not a celebration. This is not a holiday. They came here for a man who had once made kings tremble, a man who now stands bound, battered, and broken. His name is William Wallace. To England, he is a savage, a traitor, a rebel whose very existence insulted the crown. To Scotland, he is something else, a warrior, a symbol, a warning that freedom, once imagined, cannot easily be buried. And what happened to him on that August day was never really about law. It was never about justice. It was about power, about spectacle, about taking a man who had become an idea and crushing him so thoroughly that even his memory would feel dangerous. But to understand why William Wallace was made to die this way, you first have to understand the world that created him. Medieval Scotland was instability wrapped in steel. Kings died without heirs. Noble families traded loyalties like changing cloaks. Alliances collapsed overnight. Men swore oaths they never intended to keep. The kingdom was a body constantly eating itself from within, and just beyond the border waited King Edward I of England. Cold, patient, calculating. A ruler known as Longshanks, a man who did not merely want victory, he wanted submission. When Scotland weakened, Edward did what predators always do. He moved in. William Wallace was no prince, no polished court noble schooled in manners and politics. He was the son of a minor knight, raised in a harder life, in a land already bruised by conflict. But when the English killed his family, something inside him changed. Maybe something shattered. Maybe something ancient woke up. Whatever it was, it did not produce grief. It produced rage. He did not rise with wealth. He did not rise with title. He rose with fury. And in 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace and his rebels did something England never expected. They humiliated an English army. Completely. His tactics were viciously intelligent. He let the English trap themselves. Then he closed the jaws. Men were crushed, drowned, butchered, routed. It was not just a defeat, it was an insult. For one dangerous, electrifying moment, Scotland seemed capable of becoming free. But history punishes moments like that. And England never forgot the name Wallace. For years he kept fighting. Not only English armies, but silence. By then, many Scottish nobles had already bent the knee. They chose survival. They chose comfort. They chose the safety of surrender dressed up as wisdom. Wallace did not. He became harder to pin down, harder to define. A ghost moving through forests, a rumor whispered in taverns, a shadow slipping between smoke, mud, and fire. He was no longer just a man, he was becoming myth, and myths make kings nervous. So Edward hunted him, not only with soldiers but with fear, money, betrayal, and patience. And eventually, betrayal won. It came quietly, as betrayal always does, not with drums, not with banners, not with a final heroic stand. Sir John de Menteith, a fellow Scot who had chosen collaboration over resistance, handed Wallace over near Glasgow. No glorious last battle, no cinematic ending, just ropes, chains, silence. England finally had him. But capture alone was never enough. Edward did not want Wallace imprisoned. He wanted Wallace displayed, broken, transformed into a message so horrifying that every watching Scot would understand exactly what empire looked like when challenged. Wallace's journey to London was not transport. It was humiliation stretched over time. He was stripped of dignity and dragged through English towns as though he were less than human. Crowds gathered to spit at him, mock him, laugh at him. He was shown off like a hunting trophy, a living piece of propaganda. And yet, witness accounts say something unsettling. He never begged. He never collapsed into tears. He never performed the fear they wanted from him. They say he looked directly into the faces of those jeering at him, one by one, as though memorizing them, as though the condemned man was somehow judging the crowd. To England, he was the monster. But the way they treated him exposed something uglier, because monsters rarely recognize themselves. By the time August 23rd, 1305 arrived, London was ready. Westminster Hall became the stage. Wallace stood before judges who had already decided his fate long before he ever entered the room. The charges were treason, sacrilege, murder. But buried inside this trial was a cruel absurdity. Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward, and in one of his final defiant statements, he said what everyone in that hall knew was true. "I cannot be a traitor to a king I never acknowledged." That was not a defense. It was refusal. And perhaps that refusal enraged them more than any battlefield ever had. Because Wallace was not just disobedient, he was unbroken. The court did not roar in sympathy. It roared in condemnation. The sentence that followed was not merely a death sentence. It was choreography. He would be dragged through the city. He would be hanged, but not long enough to die quickly. He would be cut open while still alive. His remains would be destroyed in front of him. His body would be divided. His head would be coated in tar and placed above London Bridge. The pieces of him would be sent north, scattered like fragments of a warning. This was not punishment. This was theater written in blood. This was empire trying to terrify memory itself. And when dawn came over London, it came like any other summer morning. But the city did not feel ordinary. Something in the air had changed. The streets were not filled with mourning. They were filled with appetite. Wooden scaffolds had been raised for days. Vendors sold roasted meat and ale. Children held tight to their mothers' hands. Old men leaned on sticks for a better view. Women whispered to each other behind covered mouths. Everyone was waiting. Because what they were about to see was not simply an execution. It was public entertainment. Cruelty reshaped into ritual. Wallace was tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame meant to drag rather than carry. They hauled him from the Tower of London through the busiest streets in the city. The cobblestones tore at his flesh. Every jolt opened new pain. The city watched. Some jeered, some laughed, some stared in silence, as if trying to understand how a man feared by kings could be reduced to this. No sword in hand, no armor, no horse, no battlefield, only the body of a rebel dragged through mud like slaughtered meat. Yet even then, he did not give them what they wanted. Not surrender, not pleading, not collapse. At Smithfield, the scaffold rose over the crowd like a dark altar. Wallace was hoisted by the neck and left hanging, just long enough for agony to bloom. Not death. That would have been too merciful. The point was not to end him quickly. The point was to prolong him, to hold him in the thin space between life and oblivion. When they cut him down, he was still alive. And for a brief moment, even the noise of the crowd seemed to weaken, because now the performance entered its second act. The executioner stepped forward with deliberate calm, like a man carrying out sacred ritual rather than barbarity. What followed was slow, methodical, and meant to be seen. Wallace remained conscious through much of it. That detail matters, because the horror was not only what was done, it was that he was made to witness it. His face had gone pale. His mouth was bloodied. His body trembled uncontrollably, but his eyes were still open, still aware, still refusing to disappear. The crowd reacted in waves. Some gasped. Some turned away. Others leaned closer. A few cheered louder, as if noise could drown out the human meaning of what they were watching. But everyone knew, even if they did not say it, that this was no ordinary death. This was a state demonstrating what happened when resistance grew too visible. This was fear being taught in public. When his body could endure no more, the axe was finally raised. One clean stroke. The head fell. Blood darkened the wood beneath him, and the crowd erupted. But even then, Wallace was denied peace, because the purpose of the day had never been to kill him. It was to dismantle him. The executioner returned to the body, not to bury it, not to honor it, but to divide it. Arms removed, legs hacked apart. What had once been one man became pieces arranged for transport. Blood spread across the scaffold like spilled ink on a death sentence. One by one, the parts were wrapped and marked. Wallace was not simply executed. He was turned into geography. His tar-blackened head was raised high above London Bridge, where it remained for years, staring out over the river and the city that had cheered his destruction. The 4 quarters of his body were sent north, one to Newcastle, one to Berwick, one to Stirling, where he had once given Scotland a glimpse of hope, and one to Perth, where that hope still bled. These were not random destinations. This was message warfare, a map of terror, a declaration from England to every rebel, every dissenter, every dreamer who still believed empire could be resisted. Look carefully. This is what happens to men who refuse to kneel. Thousands had watched. Thousands had eaten, laughed, whispered, fainted, stared. Some sold food. Some sold drink. Some likely went home and repeated every detail over supper. But all of them had become witnesses to something bigger than an execution. They had watched a body become language. Wallace's death was not only physical, it was psychological, spiritual, symbolic, a medieval ritual designed to reach far beyond the scaffold. And yet, in the end, it failed, because Edward believed he was killing a rebellion. What he actually created was something far more dangerous, a martyr. Wallace's death did not silence Scotland. It deepened its anger. His dismembered body became a map, not of fear, but of unfinished war. Across the north, whispers became vows. Vows became war cries. And within a few years, Robert the Bruce would rise, not with soft words, but with steel, fire, and resolve. What Edward tried to erase became Scotland's rallying cry. Wallace had no crown, no throne, no great palace, no royal blood that gave him automatic meaning. He had one thing, a refusal to bow. That refusal survived him. His death had been designed to crush the spirit of a nation. Instead, it carved courage into its bones. In battlefields that followed, soldiers remembered his name. In taverns, stories of him spread like smoke. Mothers told their children of the man who was torn apart but never surrendered. England took his body, but it could not take what the body had come to mean. And that is why William Wallace did not truly die in 1305. Not in the way Edward intended. His name outlived the judges, outlived the executioners, outlived the scaffold. Even centuries later, it still bleeds through statues, old ruins, battlefield grass, and freedom songs. He did not live to see Scotland rise, but without his fall, it may never have stood. And above London Bridge, long after the cheering ended and the city moved on, his severed head remained. A face meant to frighten, a warning meant to silence. But over time it became something else, a symbol of defiance, a ghost that refused to vanish. That is why the execution of William Wallace was far more horrifying than most people imagine. Not only because of the pain, not only because of the brutality, but because England tried to turn him into fear and instead turned him into legend. If this story sent chills down your spine, hit like and subscribe. More brutal truths from history's darkest corners are coming. Until next time, stay curious, stay haunted,